Progressive era was a response to great corruption that gripped the industrial cities of America. This was a time in our history where our legal system was failing us greatly. The urban poor were living in dilapidated cities where the filth and corruption was unbearable. Families lived in tiny tenement houses that were hardly sufficient space for one family, yet 4 or 5 families were living on one floor. Garbage covered the streets, which resulted in unsanitary conditions that caused illness. This caused people to grow indignant. Inhumane living and working conditions were not being controlled. Government positions were being sold to the highest bidder, usually factory owners, while sweatshops ran rampant where men, women, and children were working in disgusting and dangerous working conditions for grossly underpaid salaries. Inspectors who were supposed to be protecting industrial workers were being bribed to look the other way. Before progressivism, laissez-faire policies were dominant. This meant that governments stayed out of business, but because governments were not involved in regulating businesses, monopolies and social injustice ran rampant. Progressivism was the response to these conditions. It was the muckrakers who began demanding legislative changes to make sure these cruelties and injustices were made illegal, and that the laws created were in fact enforced. One such muckraker was Florence Kelley. Reform was in Florence Kelley's blood. Her father, a United States congressman and one of the founders of the Republican Party, was a radical Republican during Reconstruction. In addition to her father, her great-aunt Sarah was a member of the Philadelphia Female Anti-Slavery Society, and she never wore slave-made clothing nor ate anything with slave-produced sugar. Kelley was one of the few women during her time to receive a college education, as she graduated from Cornell University in 1882. Because she was a woman, it was difficult for her to get a job out of college and was unable to receive a graduate education here in the United States, so she traveled to Zurich, Switzerland, where she received her graduate's degree. It was in Europe where Kelley became a follower of Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, and actually translated Engels' The Conditions of the Working Class in England, which was then published in the United States. At this point in her life, she forged a new political identity, rejecting American public culture, which tolerated social injustice. Kelley married a Russian Jewish socialist and a medical student. After her marriage, she returned to the United States in 1886 and moved to New York City. Kelley's husband, unable to open a successful medical practice, began becoming abusive. As a result, she divorced her husband and fled to Chicago. It was in Chicago where she was directed to Hull House, a social settlement founded by Jane Addams and Ellen Gates. At Hull House, she was able to resurrect her political career, as the women there helped her to be less abrasive and showed her the way of women's class-building activism. In order for progressivism to be possible, you must be able to show the injustices that are going on in society. Florence Kelley was an expert at this. Kelley and Hull House associates used data to show the poverty and injustices that were going on in this country. The governor, a progressive, appointed her to be Chief Inspector of Illinois. She targeted low wages and predatory management. Nowhere else in the Western world was a woman trusted to enforce the labor legislation. As a result, she enforced labor legislation that banned children under the age of 14 from working. In addition, it also regulated the working hours of children at age 16. Kelley's biggest career step was becoming secretary of the NCL, the National Consumer League. It was here that she tried to enact a system in which clothing and products not made in sweatshops would have a tag of approval. However, this was unsuccessful because people just wanted to get the cheapest garments possible, and it didn't matter to them whether or not it was made in a sweatshop or not, much like what we have today. As I was doing my research, I realized, how could women who don't even have the right to vote be able to enact such change in this country? And as I did further research, I realized that the reason why they were able to make such changes is because they started off small. They exposed the problems that they saw to local people. Those locals would vote for progressives who promised to make changes. Starting off small, maybe it would be mayors, then it would move on to governors, until it moved on to the presidency, as we saw with Teddy Roosevelt. And that's how they were able to make such changes when they didn't have political power themselves. Another great way that these women were able to make changes was through sociology, showing how debilitating these jobs could be. For example, as quoted by Florence Kelley in the article, "The Sweating System of Chicago," observations among sweated people confirms the opinion that a direct consequence of their occupation is a general impairment of health in both sexes. In men, the debility takes the form of consumption, either of the lungs or intestines, and of complete exhaustion and premature old age. The girls become victims of consumption, dyspepsia, and lifelong pelvic disorders. So by stating that there were health issues involved, that was able to enact changes as well, as we also saw in Muller versus Oregon, in which it showed that women were fragile, and that's why they could not work more than 8 hours a day. If they were to work more than 8 hours a day, it would cause pelvic disorders, which would thus limit their ability for bearing children. If women can't bear children, then there would be a crisis of population. This concludes my video. Thank you.